Good afternoon. I'm Michael Sanders, and this broadcast is coming to you from the auditorium at Canterbury Woods in Pacific Grove. This afternoon, I plan to play some of the wonderful songs that Louis Armstrong made popular. Also, 3 short etudes by Chopin, known as the New Etudes, Nouvelles Etudes. I suppose the first question to talk about is it Louis Armstrong or Louis Armstrong? Evidence for Louis, first of all, is that's what many, maybe most of his fans called him. Also announcers, music critics, DJs. His widow, Lucille Armstrong, calls him Louis in an interview after his death. He recorded a song called Laughing Louis, and we know that the French pronunciation of his first name is Louis, and he came from New Orleans, where that must have been a common pronunciation. On the other hand, the evidence from home recordings of Armstrong is that he referred to himself as Louis. So that's probably the right thing to do. I grew up hearing people say Louis Armstrong, and though I think Louis is probably correct, I probably go back and forth between the two. Well, I want to tell you a story of Armstrong's childhood, and then I'll play one of his first great successes, Stardust. When he was just 7 years old, living in a good-sized family without a father, at the age of 7, he began to do odd jobs from a family called the Karnofskys. They were a very poor Jewish couple who, in a sense, took him in, provided food sometimes, a loving environment. Mr. Karnofsky made his living pushing a push cart, and where he sold and bought junk. And Louis thought it might be a good idea if he played a tin horn to attract customers. I don't know how attractive that would have been to customers, but Mr. Karnofsky advanced the money that enabled Louis to buy a cornet from a pawn shop. So this was probably Louis Armstrong's first public performances, playing the cornet, walking along beside his friend Morris Karnofsky and his pushcart. So here's one of the first popular successes. It came from a musical revue called Hot Chocolates, Broadway revue, Hot Chocolates. And the song was Hoagy Carmichael's immortal Stardust. Thank you. Now, here is a piece from the other end of Armstrong's career. It's in fact the last piece that he recorded. He was at that time already very ill. Though it was planned that he would play the trumpet, somebody ended up playing trumpet for him and he just sang. The song is We Have All the Time in the World, and it was written by Hal David and John Barry. It is the part of the soundtrack of the James Bond movie On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Well, when it was released both in the United States and the United Kingdom, and it didn't make much of an impression. But 25 years later, long after Armstrong was dead, it became part of a Guinness beer commercial in England, performed by another group, and that led to the rediscovery of Armstrong's own recording, and that became quite popular. In fact, a later poll by the BBC said that this is the third most popular romantic love song performed at English weddings. In some ways that seems a little bit strange, because in the movie, the words, we have all the time in the world, are the last things that James Bond says to his new wife before she is shot to death by the villains. Not perhaps the most auspicious way to begin a marriage, I would think. Nevertheless, the song is very nice, and here it is. We have all the time in the world. A certain amount of poignancy that this should be the last recording that Armstrong made. Thank you. The next song has no formal composer. It's based on spiritual songs, probably from the end of the 19th century. It evolved in the earlier part of the early 1900s. Some of the earlier songs were called When the Saints Are Marching In and When the Saints March In for Crowning. It was Louis Armstrong who made the Saints a kind of a jazz classic standard with his recording in 1938. It's so quintessentially Armstrong, and because of that, so completely inimitable, that I sort of despaired of playing this for you, till I came across an arrangement by a name that I did not know. The name is Eugénie Rocherol. And I learned later that she's a teacher and a composer and arranger. But what struck me was the dedication. Most arrangements don't have dedications, but she made one, and this is what she wrote. Dedicated to my high school alma mater, St. Martin's Episcopal School in Metairie, Louisiana. Metairie is a suburb of New Orleans. And I don't know this, but it's nice for me to imagine that she wrote this while she was a student, a high school student. And it's touching to me because it makes me think part of a tradition goes back, who knows how long, people finding their own ways of performing this great song. So here is an arrangement of When the Saints Go Marching In. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn the focus to Paris in the first part of the 19th century. Paris at that time was perhaps the world's capital of great pianists. People came from all over the world to be pianists in Paris. They either came to be great pianists or they came to become great pianists. So it was a great place to be a teacher. And in fact, Chopin made most of his money, not from his compositions, but from his teaching to an aristocracy. One of the prominent teachers in Paris at that time was a man named Moscheles, and he was writing a book that he called The Method of Methods for learning to play the piano. And the last volume of this 3-volume set was a set of 20 advanced studies. The French word is étude, studies. And they were called, these 20 studies, études de perfectionnement, which means something like etudes for perfecting, or we might say polishing exercises or finishing exercises. So Moscheles commissioned a number of pianists from all over Europe, and Chopin was one of them. Chopin had already written 2 large volumes of etudes, the Opus 10 and the Opus 25 etudes, 12 in each set. And some of them are as formidably challenging as anything ever written, as loud and as fast and as long as any other exercises. So I imagine Moscheles was a little surprised when Chopin turned in 3 etudes for perfection, for finishing, and discovered that they weren't loud, they weren't long, they weren't fast. So I'd like to play each of these pieces, wonderful pieces, I think. The first one is a study in rhythms, we call polyrhythms. The left hand plays in groups of 4/8 notes, and the right hand plays in groups of 3/4 notes. So that's a technical challenge, but I think the real challenge is to capture this elusive, half-lit mood of this wonderful etude in F minor by Chopin, the first of the 3 so-called new etudes. Thank you. The next song is often credited to Benny Goodman, but it was actually both written and orchestrated by a man named Edgar Sampson, who was an alto saxophonist in a band led by Rex Stewart. It's named after the famous Harlem night spot, the Savoy Ballroom in New York City. Louis Armstrong was one of the great leaders of the movement to change the character of jazz from an environment of equal improvisation by the entire jazz ensemble to more of an environment of one soloist with the other players supporting that soloist. Benny Goodman, on the other hand, was famous for his wonderful arrangements of big band music where everybody got a chance to have a solo. I must say the arrangement I'm about to play is much more in the mood and in the style of Benny Goodman. So here is Stompin' at the Savoy, and it's written by Edgar Sampson. Next, I'd like to play St. Louis Blues, or perhaps St. Louis Blues, written by W.C. Handy. It's not, I suppose, technically a blues. The first and last sections are in the standard 12-bar jazz blues form, but the middle section seems to come from somewhere else, maybe someplace in the Caribbean. Handy said about it, his objective in writing the song was, quote, to combine ragtime syncopation with a real melody in the spiritual tradition. It's been called the jazzman's Hamlet. I guess with the idea that it is to a jazz player what Hamlet is to an actor, an unlimited canvas for showing whatever is personal about you. Well, I'm no jazz man, but I'd like to share this simple and very nice arrangement by Lee Evans of St. Louis Blues by W.C. Handy. Thank you. The next song was first performed in part of a musical revue that, when it moved to Broadway, was called Hot Chocolates. It must have been quite a review because Stardust was also introduced in this same evening. The band leader was Louis Armstrong, and the script called for this wonderful song by Fats Waller to be sung at the beginning of the show and then to be sung somewhere else in the program, excuse me, by a chorus. And then at another point in the show, there would be an instrumental reprise where it was played by just the instruments in the band. Well, after a few nights, the response had been so incredibly enthusiastic for Louis Armstrong's solo that the director had him climb out of the orchestral pit and move onto the stage to play this song on his trumpet. song was taught to him by the composer, Fats Waller. He said that, Armstrong said that he woodshedded it until he could play all around it. And he said he cherished the song, quote, because it was one of those songs you could cut loose and swing with. So here's Ain't Misbehavin' by Fats Waller. Thank you. Let's turn now again to the Chopin etudes. In the second of the etudes that I'll play today, the technical challenge is that the left hand and the lower fingers of the right hand play staccato, that is, separated each note from the one that follows. Meanwhile, the upper fingers of the right hand play legato, connected. And somehow this whole piece must simply sound like a charming little waltz. There are some rich and unusual harmonies. And that makes me think of Moscheles, who wrote quite an amusing memoir of his life in Paris as a pianist and as a teacher. He admired Chopin as a pianist, but he didn't think much of him as a composer. And he said that the harmonic progressions were often so harsh and the sections were strangely connected to each other and unpredictable. And yet he said when he heard Chopin play, it all seemed so smooth and natural and expressive. It doesn't seem to have occurred to him that perhaps the way he was playing it, music, was responsible for it sounding harsh and awkward. Well, anyway, here is the etude in D flat, the second of the three new etudes of Chopin. Thank you. Now let's return to American musicals. This is from The Most Happy Fella by Frank Loesser. And the song is Standing on the Corner. There's an awful lot of music in Standing on the Corner, in The Most Happy Fella. And it's sometimes been described almost more as an opera than an operetta because so much of it is sung. Loesser had this to say: I may get the impression that this show has operatic tendencies. If people feel that way, fine. Actually, all it has is a great frequency of songs. It's a musical with music. The original recording, which included almost all of the songs, all the music, stretched to 3 LPs, quite unusual for the time. Well, as a side note, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz were early backers of this show, invested some of their money in it. And there is an episode from I Love Lucy called Lucy's Night in Town, where the Mertzes and the Arnazes go out to see a musical. on Broadway. Well, what would you know? The show that they see is The Most Happy Fella, a kind of a strong plug for the show in its second year of its run. Fred Mertz says in passing something like, "This man, this most happy fellow, no wonder he wasn't married." So here is Standing on the Corner by Frank Loesser. Now, I'd like to play perhaps Armstrong's greatest commercial success. It's the title song from Hello, Dolly by Jerry Herman. Armstrong really had nothing directly to do with the musical itself, but he was asked before the show opened to record a kind of demo record of the music in order to encourage backers of the show and also to introduce the music to radio stations who might be interested in playing music when it opened. Well, the recording itself was such a great success that it was released separately and became phenomenally popular. I guess it's of interest to say that at the very beginning, Armstrong sings the song and says, "Hello, Dolly. This is Louis, Dolly." So maybe that's some evidence that Louis is his preferred pronunciation. Anyway, here is Hello, Dolly. Well, what can we say about Armstrong as a person? He seems to have been a remarkably nice man, immensely talented, of course, an incomparable trumpet player, a singer that nobody ever sounded like. He was also hardworking, radiating joy. He's band leader, composer, an entertainer on television and in movies. Some of his younger contemporaries felt that he was too silent about race relationships, that he should have used his influence more powerfully. Though it is true that he condemned Eisenhower quite publicly for what he thought was Eisenhower's lack of involvement in school integration. He loved music, of course, all kinds, not just jazz, not just popular music, but classical music, even opera. He loved religions, not just one religion, but all religions. To the end of his days, he wore a Star of David around his neck in honor of the Karnofskys, who had befriended him as a child. He also considered himself a Southern Baptist, but was baptized as a Catholic and met the Pope. He loved women. He married 4 times. He loved travel, almost anywhere. He loved writing letters, and he loved food, especially New Orleans cuisine. He always signed the many letters that he wrote, "Red beans and ricely yours." So here is one more song of Louis Armstrong, "Dream a Little Dream of Me." Words were written by Gus Kahn, music by Schwant and Andre. Now one more Chopin etude. Here the challenge is perhaps the least demanding. The left hand plays in even eighth notes and the right hand plays in triplet eighth notes. And yet it is a very humbling experience to try to play this. It's much harder than it seems. I'd like to share a quotation from Alan Walker's biography of Chopin, written in 2018. He said, "Anyone wishing to understand what differentiates Chopin's approach to the keyboard from that of his contemporaries can point to few better examples than that of the Trois Nouvelles Etudes, these three etudes that I'm playing for you. They immediately unmasks the player possessed with more brawn than brain. They disclose a world in which subtlety abounds, in which the steel-fingered, chromium-plated virtuoso can find no sanctuary. And they lend a new and unexpected meaning to the title, Études de perfectionnement, that is, etudes, studies for perfecting, where perfection resides in the ability to reveal the still, small voice lying at the center of it all." So here's the etude in A-flat, the third of the three Nouvelles Etudes of Chopin. I want to thank especially Keith Chase for recording this under less than ideal conditions. Appreciate his dedication. And I thank also the staff for making it available to you through the campus television station and also posting it on the Vibrant channel. Now, I'd like to play, I think, the greatest song that Armstrong performed. What a Wonderful World is this song. There's a story about the recording session. It took place in Las Vegas because musicians, all the studio musicians, were involved in shows in the evening. The recording session couldn't begin until midnight. Armstrong had just changed record companies. He was now with ABC Records, and the president, the ABC president, Larry Newton, came to the recording session to take some photographs. Well, what Newton was hoping for was a hit like Hello, Dolly. And when he heard the slow and meditative tempo of What a Wonderful World, he was not pleased, and he tried to stop the recording. They ended up locking him out of the recording studio. And they began, but it turned out the recording studio was not entirely soundproof, and the sound of train whistles from nearby twice interrupted the recording. Well, Armstrong laughed all this off, kept upbeat and cheerful, and the recording, after all of that time, finished about 6 in the morning. So Armstrong arranged that he would only be paid union scale, which was something like $250, in order that all of the other musicians could be properly recompensed from their extra overtime. Well, Newton didn't like the song and refused to promote it. And although it was a #1 hit in England, it never got much attention in America until more than 20 years later, when it became part of the soundtrack of Good Morning Vietnam, and became the well-loved, enormously popular performance that it is now. I guess I'm glad to know that Newton lived long enough to know how wrong he was about this song, and what an enormously meaningful song it is for everybody. A good way to remember Louis Armstrong. This is What a Wonderful World.